to just back up a little bit, that, you know, we are all, I have the protests in my office in Toronto. This has resonated with certain environmentalists, that this is like the talisman, the key to the environment, as a symbolic, important example. And I guess as a government, we're really trying to say the environment and the economy have to go together, and that we're in this transition period now where all of us are trying to wean ourselves from fossil fuel, communities trying to get off diesel, that there is a weaning that's going on. But at the moment, we have to get stuff safely around. And I just, from my point of view, I now have in my riding, since 2012, the amount of crude in rail cars has tripled through my riding, sometimes 80 units of crude going straight through downtown Toronto. And the same train that went to Lac-Mégantic had come through my riding first. So, you know, I think that we aren't doing a good job explaining that we have to have those two conversations together. And so that the First Nations near Gogama, where there was that train derailment, that we actually have to be able to have the trains are going right down past pristine lakes. They're going, you know, this is a conversation where we've got to do a better job explaining that stopping everything until we've got a solution. I mean, I got my electric car this summer, or this spring, but that's not gonna cut it in terms of how we heat our homes and how we get from A to B until we've got a real alternative. In the meantime, this pipeline is viewed to be the best approach. It's not carving through pristine forest, it's twinning an existing pipeline. And it's viewed to be the best way of doing this, with keeping the environment and the economy, you know, in our heads at the same time. So I think that from the government's point of view, and again, this obviously is not my fault, but it is my fault because I agree with everything you've said, that we want to deal with poverty, we want to deal with all of the things. The 2% cap really is gone, but we need to be just open to, and lots of people are saying to us that that whether it's investors, whether it's environmentalists, whether it's people worrying that this might not happen, the idea of having ownership by First Nations is very appealing to a lot of people. They are in that, if only sort of, if only the First Nations could get together and own this, you know, or have a significant part of it, that it would deal with a lot of the misinformation that's out there, and the rather simplistic view that some of the ban everything everywhere people are you know, articulated. So you know, I will, you know, want to work with you and with obviously Minister Sohi, Finance is, you know, Minister Morneau and the Finance Department are really the ones sort of who will take the decisions about the next steps. But you know, whatever I can do to you know, stay current with the as we go to cabinet 2 weeks from now, I guess 3 weeks from now in Nanaimo, where the cabinet retreat will be there. And I know that this, you know, that almost all of the cabinet ministers, including the Prime Minister, are very interested in what the next steps would be, and how you are coming to get organized in terms of a proposal or you know, the next step. So that's you know, so if there's anything that you want me to take forward in terms of, I certainly have taken the notes, and Jim is here, and that Jim will also deal with his colleagues within the other departments that are relevant, and we'll just sort of stay in touch at this critical time.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, we have.
Yeah, I'm going to stand up to 10 feet from my ear. I just barely see your hair, so.
So we have.
Anyway, just Chief Walkman, I think some of the things we have to do, it's the same thing we did with the tank farm. We're not asking the Canadian taxpayers to give us the cash to be part of all this. Okay? We can do it on the bond issues, like we did with the East Tank Farm with the Port McKay First Nation. Because as soon as you get monies from the taxpayers, once the taxpayers go up in arms, just a suggestion. Okay, I'll tell you, you better take that to your caucus. We don't want handouts. I think we had enough of that.
Yes.
Councillor Gary Lehman, Beaver Lake Cree Nation, proxy. If you're really upfront about working with First Nations, settle with Beaver Lake. Okay? We have a lawsuit with the province and with the federal government. What we're talking about is sharing the revenues, having our say. First Nations having their say. If the government of Canada is really upfront about working with us, start settling with First Nations like Beaver Lake. Take that to the caucus as well.
Oh, no, Sunday, not like how you see and need the beginning, but I die. But I did the citizen, secretary at the end of a knee loud. He had no idea I write you, without no Jen answer, no need answer, no dying answer. Arrow. Father tenen a ning delo, anto night day, continue night delo, father key delo, a road father had some of yo, unto die jacket. Like any, that he didn't mean delo, that he didn't, anto no center key, you go to the whole answer that, handy in the western, anto 30 whole and 90, and tell it and real that 90. Arrow that is the name say quick 9 deal, 9 deal, going to assume who are that that is dying out to the job, dying it, that is that to the title thing. Arrow samba, Nahia, kiss on Neil Yow, it is someone Nahia kiss, it is out and to sue, I see. You need going to the night day home artist. Samandaya Chris, I see that Alu, there's Helu, talking the share, you see. No needs and coil there, you see. No send need in the Canadian, no any low, and you air down. No need, but I see the name, never sent go there, you see. Mary, I tell you, who's true, artist. Needs and go there, you see. Nuni sang ko ilte atising. Tatu suwa has gone to yati. Tas sidor is not already not dog in one thing. Nuni the dagar ni kanafte ho atising. Not kuntu ho atising. He are continue to ni ho atising. No one in the body gonna get some bahala. Some there. No one in the care lot is it. Can I go there, see down yet? No one in the care. This will not you. I told Lodnick at the Nara Hill, Naiti, and then the Senate Samadas here to say. And what the Yazula Hote. Fully, no one in the Universal Coil there. That's a good day there. No rest at home, I say. I don't know what Suga I say. Must say.
Thank you.
Morning, Councilor Ruben Breaker, Six Nation. Minister, I just wanted some clarity on the 10-year grant funding. Where does that tie in with the legislation that's going to be coming in the fall? Why 10 years, and what's going to happen after 10 years?
I don't know what they're, the 10-year funding approach is really what Dr. Philpott is doing in Indigenous services for the communities that are still under the Indian Act. What the legislation that we are proposing, and I mean, I think I should say right now, it doesn't, the framework doesn't exist because we haven't finished listening to people about what needs to be in it or not. But what the legislation is about is how do we make it easier for people to get out of the Indian Act and for us to get out of the way. So the legislation is really just an admission that the comp claims process didn't work, the inherent right policy doesn't work, and that we actually have to get out of the way and hold Canada to account for the kinds of agreements that we sign. And so that whether it's treaty and honoring our role in treaty, it is in terms of any of the modern agreements to self-determination or rebuilding of nations, that the Land Claims Coalition, which are the people who already have a modern treaty or are out from under the Indian Act, want legislation that will hold Canada to account. They have asked us for changes to the Interpretation Act. They've asked us to have an auditor, a treaty commissioner within the Auditor General's office or a oversight body reporting directly to Parliament. They want it to be more clear as to how you hold Canada to account to honor the agreements. And so that's really the legislation where we believe we need is to move from that denial of rights approach where you have to claim rights and then go to court to prove the rights. You start with recognizing the rights and then getting to a table. Now, over 320 communities are already at a table. Whether it's drawing, or drawing down or asserting jurisdiction on child and family services, or coming together to do an education school system, whether it's the treaty group, whether it's Treaty 8 and their child welfare, or office on and off reserve. There are already many communities in this process of trying to get out from under the India Act and assert jurisdiction. And so that's what the legal framework would do. It's mainly about holding Canada to account and removing the barriers that have been there in the way, like the comp claims policy, the inherent right policy, this denial of rights approach, and being able to say this is the way Canada will behave across all government departments in the future. And so it is about having legislation in place such that future governments can't return to a denial of rights approach, or the failed comp claims or inherent right policy that has extinguishment, cede and surrender, all of those things, operating on loans for these conversations, that we're trying to make sure that we are able to put in place a system that holds Canada to account. That's what that's about. The funding arrangements for self-determining nations are already in the process of being negotiated every 5 years, because things change, right? So that and we are also as we are working together at these tables, that a lot of the tables now want a periodic review. They don't want full and final agreements anymore, because things change, and whether it's climate change or whether it's the jurisprudence of court cases, those kinds of things. We need to be able to sign agreements that can be periodically reviewed, and so those are the kinds of things that we are looking to in the legal framework. But that's why it's the recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights, because it's on the implementation side, as Alan said, the implementation of treaty, the implementation of agreements needs to be more certain, to make sure that Canada is implementing the agreements honorably. So that's really what it is. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. I think that in terms of whether it's a white paper or whether it's creating municipal governments, that's not at all. We have no interest in that. We want communities to build governance of their own making in a way that honors traditional legal practices, honors your own laws, honors the customs, and such that we get out of the way, and we're not telling you who to partner with or how to do anything. We're just getting out of the way so you can do what you want.
Maybe one question that has to be asked, Minister.
Sorry.
Just one quick question, and this is to this, but are the First Nations that are not gonna enter into a 10-year funding agreement with Canada, are they gonna be punished for not entering into that kind of thing? That has to be expressed, because nobody's talking about anything,
Okay.
right? So.
No, absolutely not. No, this is, it's opting in, and there's no, I think Jim would tell you that there's absolutely no interest in punishing anybody. It's just this is all about choice. Would you rather do this or that? And it's not our choice. It's the community's. Yeah.
So is your 4% compound added to the 10-year agreement on that, or is it just one lump sum right across? Because if you're gonna do that, does the cap still go up this way?
Well, there is no cap, and so the agreements are what they are. They're agreements going forward in terms of what is needed for a community. So that's how they're looking at what it takes for you to run your governments, and without us saying there's, you can only spend this amount on this and this amount on that, and you can't move things around. It's about having the flexibility for you to be able to set your priorities and fund them appropriately. That's the intent of the services. But that as the Prime Minister said on the steps at Rideau Hall last summer, eventually Indigenous services, that department disappears, because we want all of the programs and services delivered by your own governments. So eventually we want your own governments to be delivering these in in the way that we fund self-governing nations, as in Yukon or other places.
So
Yeah.
we have three speakers already, and we have 5 minutes with ministers. So it's Chief Mackinac, Chief from Sixican, and Regina is the third speaker. So,
good morning, Minister. I guess my question is, we're talking to citizens previously in some of our meetings. We're always missing one player in all our agreements, it's Infrastructure Canada. And because they have billions of dollars sitting there, and they should be they should be included in our CFAs when it comes to our roads, our lighting, our sidewalks, all that infrastructure that we need, our sewer, wastewater lines, all that. They should be included in all this. But I know INAC won't have the dollars to do all that, 600 and some bands across Canada. We need to find a different way. And I think that would be one way of dealing with our infrastructure needs, and that has to be looked at. And then the other one is the 1965 transfer agreements, because the dollars go to the provinces and all that programs, those 5 major programs. Why can't the dollars come back to the bands now? In some of these areas, because we're ready to start taking these dollars. If we could start accessing those dollars too, besides what we have in our CFAs, we'll be able to do more for our people. So you can bring that to your retreat and talk about that. Because, we can, if you're talking about NRTA, this goes in line with that too. So, we can get all these acts and whatnot in place and start dealing with them, and which in turn will pull more dollars back to the bands. So that's just a suggestion for future consideration and discussion at the cabinet level, because I know you do have meetings at these times every year.
As a member of the working group chaired by the Minister of Justice, you're mandated through the letter from the Prime Minister, as were all the other ministers, for certain responsibilities, and yours includes the working to develop a recognition of rights framework, ensuring the Crown is fully executing its legal, constitutional, and international human rights obligations and commitments, including constitutionally protected treaty rights. Now, Siksika Nation has had a claim in the court since 1960. We've been at the table and we were getting reassurances about certain timelines. But now, looking at the Elections Act, the federal election has to be called by the 3rd week of October, which means the writ has to be passed 5 weeks before. So that means next year around this time, when we're waiting for Parliament to resume, there's going to be all kinds of promises that, yes, we'll get back to you, we'll do this, we'll do that. But the way I see it, by the time you resume in fall of 2019, you're only going to have time to do the writ, and then you're going to be moving on to an election. So what's the time frames? I mean, are we looking at when Parliament dissolves in spring of 2019? Is that it? Is there going to be, are we going to get an answer as to the working group from the Department of Justice and yourself as to what this rights framework is going to be?
So the working group is also, so after 1982, a whole bunch of work was done on sections 1 to 34, the charter, to make sure all the laws and policies of Canada were in keeping with the charter. That work was not done on section 35, and that's what the working group is doing now, is to try and sort out the kinds of things that we need to change in order to move forward, and so some of the and across all government departments. So that is separate than what I've been asked to do now in terms of putting the legal framework in place to make sure that we are honoring the inherent in treaty rights in section 35. We are now trying to operationalize or implement a government approach to honoring your rights, both as treaty and inherent rights. So that is the time frame for that. Is the Prime Minister has asked that we now are working over the summer to try and co-develop some drafting instructions such that we would be able to table something by the fall and be able to then put it through the full parliamentary process, both the House of Commons and the Senate, and the committees would travel and we would actually be able to because I think the Prime Minister is very aware that if we get to this time next year, that you're in an election and that things sort of grind to a halt in those months leading up to it as well. So the Prime Minister is very much hopeful that we would have this legal framework passed before the election.
So my concern is related to the fact that the Department of Justice accepted the fact that Canada illegally sold half of our land set aside by treaty 10 years ago. The studies were done a year ago, and we have yet to hear back to see if a financial mandate has been reached. And now, looking at the way the government works, this fiscal year, there's no money set aside for this. And we've, I don't know if we're being passed on till after elections again. This has been going on since 1960.
No, I mean, I think we're working very hard on as many agreements and as many settlements as we can, and I think that's my job, is to try and move these things faster. And any of this work on a legal framework or anything is not, the verb in my mandate letter is accelerate. We're trying to make sure that we're moving forward on all those things at the same time as we are trying to put the legal framework in place to make sure that we are on a good footing for the next 150 years.
So Regina has a one short statement.
Don't cut me off, you're not AFN. No, good morning, Minister. I just want, I get very concerned when you start talking about framework, all these legislations. And yet you were at the UN and you said Canada has adopted the UN Declaration without qualification. So you say that in an open forum with the UN, then you come home and you start legislating. So we have a right to self-determination. We are nations. And I'm concerned that why is Canada always legislating, trying to delegate or get us to negotiate our right to self-determination, our right to government, and all of that? Canada is not signatory to a treaty, and I've told you that many times. And I've told you about the treaty. We are nations. We have a right of self-determination. We set up our own political structures. All our societies, which Canada has destroyed, now is the opportunity for us to regain that. But at the same time, Canada is not signatory to treaty. Great Britain is. Great Britain is the one that delegates authority to Canada through your constitutional instruments. And don't disagree, because who did the BNA Act? Who did the Constitution Act of 1982? Who did that? That's the Crown. You still have a Governor General in place. But
she's appointed by us.
I don't care.
Yeah.
She's still the
She's
Governor
appointed
General.
by the-
I don't care who appoints her.
Yeah.
She is still the Governor General representing the Crown. So you look at that. And then you tell us that's just a token position. Well, that's crap to us. But if you look at, so now you're talking about all these legislations. 10-year agreement. Canada was given the responsibility to look after the promises of treaty. So is Phil Pott trying to set up this 10-year agreement and then nothing? And you keep saying, we want you on your own, we get out of the barriers, take all those barriers away. Canada has a legal, constitutional obligation toward treaties, the benefits under treaty. And we're all treaty Indians here. So how many of us are going to get the true benefits from treaty? And we don't want poverty. You keep saying that. You know, you've said that, we don't wanna manage poverty. So when is Canada gonna live up to those? All we have to do is set out our treaty-based funding arrangements with Canada. You don't need to delegate our right to government, our right to make our own laws, because we already have that. In fact, we should be delegating that to Canada because they're in our country, you know, and without our treaties, they won't be here. So we gotta set that record straight, and I get very frustrated. And the government separated DISC and your department, you're dealing with our relationship with it. And yet DISC has all the monies, and those are programs and services used across the country. Where's your money to deal with our treaties? To pay for the benefits, the promises of treaty? Where is it? You don't have any money. You know, so how can we talk our relationship or our political relationship with Canada when you have no money? And DISC has it that for programs and services across the country. That concerns me. So, we are nations, Canada has a legal obligation, and we should be setting out our treaty-based funding arrangements so Canada can fulfill those promises under treaty. I'm tired of lip service. You know, shit, I'm 74 years old and I'm still hearing the same thing. You know, and I want to die peacefully. And I've been an advocate for our treaty all my life. And you know that. So let's get it straight. No more legislations to delegate some authority to us or to negotiate, and Canada fulfill their obligations under treaty for our people, so our peoples don't live in poverty anymore. Thank you.
Thank you, because really it gives me the opportunity to say, you have your laws and we need our laws to make sure that we behave in a just way in working with you in treaty, and we actually need to codify our behavior that honors treaty and honors inherent rights, and so that's really what's going on. The money is absolutely true that in services, but eventually that money becomes yours when you run all your own services and programs. That's eventually, Jane's department will no longer exist. And when that no longer exists, then the money is coming to you to run your own programs and services as government. So my money is not sitting in a budget, but that we have lots of money to you know, like now for the you know, from the but we have to go get the money in order to sign agreements.
There's also Indian money set aside for our treaty India. So there's that money.
Yeah. Well, we have money to settle agreements in order, like the Williams Treaty, like the ones that we have. We're working away at settling these, and I'm working away to get out of court. Yeah.
So that is all ended the minister's time, and we have another candidate at the door waiting to come and speak to you. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. Good to see you.
So we have,
Don't you say I would like to do it?